Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going back to 1393.
It's 1493.
Yeah, a year that really set off a new era of global exploration.
Yeah.
And honestly, a lot of territorial disputes too.
Yeah.
We're looking at this 1899 paper today called The Lines of Demarcation by Samuel Edward Dawson.
Yeah.
And get this, it even gets into how they measured distances back then, before GPS and all that.
Crazy. It's wild to think about, right? A single line drawn by Pope Alexander VI had ripple effects for centuries. We're talking exploration conquests, empires rising and falling, all because of where this one line went.
Okay, so maybe a dumb question, but in 1493, did the Pope really have that kind of power to just draw lines on a map?
You'd be surprised.
Really?
Back then, the Pope's word carried serious weight. I mean, he was a major power broker in Europe, especially when it came to settling disputes over these newly discovered lands, which were seen as totally up for grabs.
So this paper, The Lines of Demarcation, it gets into the histories with the legal stuff and even how they measured things back then.
Exactly. Dawson does a fantastic job of busting some myths about this whole thing.
Okay.
So the papal bull called Inter Cetera basically drew a line down the Atlantic, 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands.
Okay.
Everything west and south went to Spain, east went to Portugal. Seems pretty straightforward, right?
Well, I'm already lost with leagues.
Okay.
How far is a league? Anyway, is that like a super long marathon or something?
Hold that thought. We'll get to the whole distance thing later. It's a lot more complicated than you might think.
Go boy.
And it's super important. But first, let's unpack this papal bull a bit more.
Okay, lay on me.
All right, so what made this line so significant?
Yeah.
Well, for starters, it wasn't just some random whim. It was based on legal ideas of the time. Okay. And a desire to keep Spain and Portugal, the exploration powerhouses, from going to war over these new lands. Kind of an early version of spheres of influence agreements we see today.
So like, you stay on your side of the sandbox, we'll stay on ours, and everyone keeps their toys.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. The paper brings up this Spanish theologian, Francis of Victoria.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him. Wasn't he way ahead of his time in arguing for indigenous people's rights?
Absolutely. Victoria basically said the Pope couldn't just hand over land that was already inhabited. Imagine the guts it took to challenge the Pope's authority like that back then.
Seriously. That must have ruffled some feathers.
Oh, yeah.
So you're saying even back then, people were questioning whether it was ethical to just carve up the world like this?
You got it. And those ethical dilemmas are still with us today. But back to the story.
Okay.
Things got even more complex the following year with the Treaty of Tordesillas. Remember that 100-league line?
Yeah, the one that divided everything up.
Well, Portugal wasn't thrilled with it. They wanted a bigger piece of the pie, especially South America. So they negotiated to move the line westward to 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands.
Wait, so they just moved the line?
Yeah.
How did they even know where to put it? Weren't maps pretty unreliable back then?
That's a great question. And it highlights the ambiguities of this whole treaty.
Okay.
You see, they didn't specify which Cape Verde island to measure from.
Oh, no. That's like saying, meet me 10 miles outside of Chicago. Chicago is huge-e.
Exactly. And Dawson points out this intriguing detail. A Spanish expert named Jaime Ferrer argued that they should measure from the middle island of the Cape Verde group.
So strategic. You can practically hear the gears turning as they try to figure out how to get the most land.
It really highlights the power plays going on. Everyone was trying to maximize their potential territory. Of course, the big problem with both the Papal Bull and the treaty is that they completely ignored the indigenous people who already lived there.
It's easy to forget that these lands weren't just empty spaces waiting to be claimed.
Right.
There were already thriving cultures and societies.
Oh, that's right. But before we dive into that, let's go back to your question about leagues. It might seem like a small detail, but understanding how they measured distances is actually crucial to grasping the true impact of these lines.
All right, deep divers, get ready for a quick history lesson on how they navigated the world before Google Maps. Okay, so remind me again, why is it so important to understand how they measured distances back then? I mean, a mile's a mile, right?
Not quite. You see, Dawson's paper really digs into the whole mess of historical metrology. It's like trying to bake a cake, but your recipe have all these weird units. A little bit of this, a pinch of that.
Yeah.
Good luck getting it right.
Okay, I can see how that would be a problem. Especially when you're talking about dividing up entire continents.
Exactly.
So what were they using besides leagues?
Well, you've got Roman miles,
Okay.
Italian leagues, which, by the way, are different from regular leagues.
Oh, great.
And then there are Greek stades.
Stades?
Yeah, all interconnected but with slightly different values.
Ugh, it's enough to make your head spin.
It really is. And then on top of that, you've got this book, Summa de Geographia, by Enciso from 1519.
Yeah, basically a guide for sailors, right?
Exactly. And Enciso adds another wrinkle to the whole thing.
Okay.
He talks about calculating distances based on the elevation of the pole star.
Can you imagine navigating by the stars? I can barely find my way out of a parking lot these days.
I know, right? But that was the reality? So how accurate were they really?
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. Even their estimations of the Earth's circumference were all over the place.
Yeah.
Like Aristotle thought it was 400,000 stades.
Okay.
Columbus, he thought it was much smaller. Only 163,200 stades.
No wonder he thought he had landed in India. He was working with a totally different idea of how big the world even was.
Exactly. But even with all this variation, there were some bright spots. Like Enciso, for example.
Okay.
He advocated for a degree of 17.5 leagues, a measurement based on practical navigation. And honestly, pretty darn accurate for the time.
So they weren't totally off then?
Not at all.
So how does all this tie back to the line of demarcation?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
You see, if we try to map that Tordesillas line accurately today, based on modern measurements, it wouldn't even cut through North America.
Wait, what? So all this time we've been thinking about this line dividing up the Americas, and it doesn't even come close?
Not according to our understanding today. But here's the thing. Historical maps from back then consistently show the line cutting through Nova Scotia near Cape Race.
So basically, they were working with a totally different map in their heads.
Yeah.
Their whole understanding of geography was just completely different.
Exactly. They believed that region, which is now part of Canada, was right in the middle of Portugal's territory. And there's historical evidence to back this up. Like, King Ferdinand of Spain was super worried that John Cabot, an explorer sailing for England...
John Cabot, remind me who that is.
Oh, he was an Italian explorer who, like, Columbus was looking for a westward route to Asia. Yeah. He made a couple of voyages in the late 1490s exploring the coast of North America. But Ferdinand was concerned because he believed Cabot's voyages were taking him into territory that Portugal claimed because of the Tordesillas line.
So even the monarchs were caught up in this whole geographical tug of war.
Right, absolutely. It wasn't just theoretical. It had real-world consequences.
Wow.
And here's something else to think about.
Good.
If you look at maps of the Canadian coast, you'll find a bunch of Portuguese names.
Huh.
That's a tangible legacy of their historical presence in the region, all because of how they understood that line.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is this line wasn't just some abstract concept. It actually shaped the exploration and even the naming of North America.
Exactly. And it reminds us that history is full of surprises, especially when we dig a little deeper and challenge our assumptions.
Speaking of surprises, I can't help but wonder what if that line had been drawn differently, just a few degrees east or west. How would that have changed things?
The big what if of history.
Right.
It's a question that's both fascinating and impossible to answer for sure, but it's definitely worth considering. Imagine a world where Portugal controlled a larger chunk of North America, or where Spain's influence extended further east. How would that have impacted the development of those regions? The cultures, the languages, the politics, everything could have been different.
That's mind-blowing. It really shows how even seemingly small details can have huge ripple effects throughout history.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I love about history. It's not just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding how those seemingly minor events and decisions connect to the bigger picture.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
what
are some of the key takeaways you hope our listener is taking away from all of this?
Yeah, it really makes you think, right? Like, history isn't always about those big, flashy events.
Right.
Sometimes it's the little things, a line on a map.
Yeah.
Or a change in measurement that end up having the biggest impact.
Absolutely. And in this case, that line on a map back in 1493.
Yeah.
It really helped shape the world as we know it.
So before we finish up the deep dive,
what are some of the biggest aha moments you hope our listener is walking away with?
Well, first off, I hope they understand that the papal line, while important, it was really just the starting point.
Okay.
Remember that Treaty of Tordesillas, the one Portugal negotiated to get a better deal?
Right, yeah.
That's the agreement that really shaped the division of the Americas?
Yeah, it's a good reminder that history is rarely neat and tidy.
Right.
It's messy. There's a lot of back and forth.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes, let's be honest, some pretty ruthless power grabs.
Exactly. And that brings me to my second point. The importance of context. You know, we might look back at that papal bull and think, wow, the Pope just claimed half the world.
Yeah.
But back then, it was seen as totally within his authority. It fit with the legal and political norms of the time.
It's a good reminder that we can't judge historical figures solely through our modern lens.
Right.
We have to try to understand their actions within the context of their world.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And lastly, I think this whole discussion really highlights the importance of critical thinking.
Yeah.
You know, we see maps showing that line cutting through the Americas, and we assume that's how it was.
Right.
But as we've learned, the reality is much more complicated.
It's a good lesson for all of us, right?
Yeah.
Don't just take things at face value. Dig deeper, ask questions, and you might be surprised by what you find.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of history. It's a constant process of discovery and reinterpretation.
Well said.
Yeah.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the papal line of demarcation. It's been a fascinating journey, and we hope you've enjoyed exploring this pivotal moment in history with us.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.